All right. Good morning, everyone. This is the East Side Seventh-day Adventist Fellowship Adult Bible School class covering Prophets and Kings. And it's chapter 54, which is entitled A Rebuke Against Extortion. So don't sign off based on the title. It'll actually be pretty good, I think. I'm John Griffin. This is Jody. And we have my dad, John Sr., and it is his birthday weekend. And he has finally entered the 80 and age category, but he is muted. And then my brother-in-law, Lee Meadowcroft, join us as panelists. And so the date is February 18, 2023. And we are covering, like I said, this chapter 54, in Prophets and Kings, Rebuke Against Extortion. So the last couple chapters have been on Ezra. In fact, I think it was there were two prior chapters on Ezra and then an introductory chapter on Nehemiah. What I found interesting in doing a little bit of a background study on this was that Ezra was the one responsible for writing not only the book of Ezra, but also the book of Nehemiah. And so these guys were definitely contemporaries, both probably in Babylon at least, but certainly in Jerusalem. And both of them worked for the king. Both of them were moved to do something more for the temple in Jerusalem, and then actually the city and the city wall was the main mission for both Ezra and Nehemiah. This chapter is an interesting interlude in the whole book of Nehemiah, which my dad read the book of Nehemiah. I was going to have him do a summary, and maybe we still should do a summary. But basically, it's pretty easy to kind of see what the gist of Nehemiah is by just reading the headings. So Nehemiah's prayer is after he's moved to do something, he had to approach the king. And so he prayed to God. And then the king answers the prayer by sending Nehemiah to Jerusalem. And Nehemiah, remember the kid's story, at midnight gets out and inspects the walls. So he's prepared to confront everyone in Jerusalem with the project that he's wanting to do, with the help of the king, by the way. And so he inspects the walls, he gets the people together, and they start building the walls. Like any good project, there is some opposition, I guess. It's almost always expected. And then there's this chapter 5, which I'm tempted to read, but I'm going to come back to in just a minute, where Nehemiah helps the poor is the chapter. But that's what we're going to be covering in this chapter 54, Prophets and Kings. But then all of a sudden, boom, after this chapter, it's back to further opposition to the rebuilding. And then finally, the completion of the wall, and then a list of exiles. And then Ezra reads the law. Israel confesses their sins. And then they have all the people, after they confess, agree to continue to follow God's law. And they list some new residents to Jerusalem, including priests and Levites, and then they have a dedication. And then Nehemiah, the last chapter 13, is some final reforms by Nehemiah. I have to tell you, Nehemiah is a little bit of a controversial figure in my mind. Well, two things. One is he kind of seems to me to be, in some ways, almost the first Pharisee, him and Ezra. And I think in some ways, maybe he did such a good job in reforming Israel that they went from one extreme, which was not following God's law, to a completely other extreme, which is what we see when Jesus finally shows up. And that is such a strict following of the law that the reason for the law is often forgotten. And it comes down to just dotting I's and crossing T's and punishments if you don't do that. So that's one thing with Nehemiah. The other thing is I'm a little frustrated, or I was a little frustrated, that Ezra and Nehemiah are put where they are in the book of the Bible, because if you remember, the last chapters that we covered were Zechariah, and that's Hosea, Zechariah were the last two main people that we talked about. And, along with Daniel and Ezekiel, and that's kind of all towards the end of the Old Testament. And I open up my Bible to find Ezra and Nehemiah, and it's all the way back before Psalms, Job and Psalms, and right after Chronicles. But then I realized with the history of what was going on, a lot of these books, I think, and Sam can correct me if I'm wrong, were compiled while the Israelites were in captivity in Babylon for 70 years. And in a lot of ways, it makes sense. They had resources that they might not have had otherwise in Jerusalem where they were. And certainly with the apostasy that they were involved with, there was no motivation to do it. But all of a sudden, there's not as much apostasy. They're in captivity. And there's a lot of downtime, presumably. They don't have their careers and all of that. And then they have these resources where they start putting some of this information together for ultimately what would be the Bible that Jesus would use, and also what we consider the Old Testament in a lot of ways. And I do remember I enjoy the Psalms and going through. At some point, these books were put together by others. Psalms were not put together by David. And same with Proverbs with King Solomon and stuff. So and so that's why partly at least Nehemiah was Ezra and Nehemiah are where they are. It's after Kings and Chronicles, and then before Job, Psalms, and Proverbs, in case you're wondering. All right. So I want to just review this chapter 5 in brief. And then Jody says sometimes I talk too much, but I'm looking at the time, so we stay on time here. So Nehemiah 5, the other thing would be to just read it through completely. But basically, Nehemiah gets the building on the walls of the city of Jerusalem started. And then some people come by and say that they are hungry, basically. They don't have enough food. And then some of them don't have enough money, and so they're actually mortgaging their fields, presumably their houses and their vineyards, so that they can buy food. And then others are having problems because they aren't their own kingdom, so they're having to pay the king of Babylon, or the Xerxes, taxes and stuff. And it's gotten bad enough that they're not only hungry, but they're having to borrow money. And in that culture, at least, part of borrowing money or getting resources was, it wasn't enslavement per se, but they call it slavery, where sons and daughters were basically, mortgaged off, and they could be redeemed. But it was with a price once the debt was paid. And then above and beyond all of that, the money they were borrowing was being lent at a very high interest rate that was unfair. And apparently Nehemiah, I'm a little torn, because apparently Nehemiah wasn't aware of this. But then later in the chapter, you find out that he was actually proactively taking care of the problem. So I don't know if this whole chapter happened all at once or whether there was a time frame with it, and it doesn't really say. But when he hears this, he's very upset. And to his credit, he thinks about it and then gets together with people and confronts them with the situation, and then gets them to agree to not do this. and gets things taken care of. I think that's probably the best way to summarize this chapter. There's obviously a little bit of details that I didn't get to, but I don't want to be talking the whole time. So often with these Sabbath schools, we start out with what was your first impression? And this is where Jody likes to jump in.
Somebody might take my words. No, I thought this was an interesting chapter, and I felt like it was kind of divided into sections almost. There's like the talking about the poor and how they were oppressed, and then it goes to Nehemiah's actions about it, and then it goes into greediness, and then it talks about a little bit about people in the church. It's pretty hard on any kind of, it's a little hard in places on wealth and the love of money and the love of display. It's hard on that. But then, yeah, I thought it was interesting how Ellen White moves on from the poor and how they were oppressed. And I think, I was like, I'll be curious where this conversation leads, because we could talk about the poor and homelessness or houselessness or something like that for a lot. And then I don't know if she goes into this thing. The church is responsible for their members, talking about like we're supposed to, I guess, I'm not sure if we're supposed to kick people out of the church if they are greedy, or I don't know, that part was kind of confusing to me. But I do like the part that Nehemiah was somewhat of a leader and then actually spoke out against the injustices that were going on. And so when we look at this, like the verse in Micah 6:8, to do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly, that verse kind of came to my mind as I was reading this.
All right.
Yeah.
So
Go
ahead.
When I first read the title, a rebuke against extortion, I thought, well, that's kind of a no-brainer. But there was actually more in this than I thought there would be. And there's the two things that really stuck out were talking about Nehemiah it's on page 650 on my book, but the one thing on a personal level, it says, Ellen White says, but instead, he might have demanded large contributions for his personal benefit, but instead of this, he had not taken even that which justly belonged to him. And that, on a personal level, that's where I think we struggle. I think it's well, this is mine. It's my by right. This is mine, or I've done everything right. But it's that next step of saying, yeah, you might be entitled to this, but it's foregoing what you're entitled to. That on a personal level, I think, well, I know I could struggle with that, and I think we all struggle with that. And then kind of what Jody was already talking about is, yeah, she goes into this corporate level. And the one thing that, and this is a sad truth, but she talks about avarice and treachery are seen in the lives of those who have the name of, or who profess the name of Christ, because the church retains on her books the names of those who have gained their possessions by injustice. The religion of Christ is held in contempt. And that really struck out in my head, because I can't speak for the world, but I can speak for in the United States. Christianity, I think, has a very bad name among non-Christians because of the actions of people who say, we're doing this for the Lord. And you see how it's portrayed, how Christianity is portrayed in the news, and things like that. I think Christianity does have a really bad name. I mean, at least some of the non-believers that I know, they're like, yeah, I want nothing to do with that. That stuff is, those people are crazy. And I think that's sad, but I think there's a truth there. So anyway, I'm just talking now, rambling.
No, you come up with, both of you have touched on things that came to mind for me. And actually, initially, you guys know I like to do things that are a little edgy sometimes. I was going to poll, there's 4 panelists here, and I was going to poll everyone to see whether they were for or against extortion. Obviously a little bit tongue in cheek. And then I was going to have you use the reaction button for a thumbs up, thumbs down, kind of a Caesar approach to extortion. But apparently the reactions only give you a thumbs up option. There's no thumbs down option. So we won't do that. And I won't put everyone on the spot, but I would say there were a couple questions that came to mind when this happened. I mean, we, at least Jody and I, have had points in our life where, I didn't have the job and we were in between jobs usually. And then I didn't have the money that we, needed to basically pay for the house, pay for the food, have gas for the cars, kind of a thing. And I think everyone in their life has had a point where they've had to kind of think about how you're going to handle that. I mean, do you just run up the credit card bills? In a lot of ways, you could say credit card interest is almost a form of extortion, but it's a lot smaller and easier to use than getting a bank loan, which might be better, or even, borrowing money from family. So, I think it's like you said, I initially looked at it, for or against extortion, and that's kind of a no-brainer. Everyone's going to be against extortion just because of the way it sounds. But I think we've all been in situations where we borrowed money and maybe even loaned money. I mean, how many of us have borrowed money with interest? How many of us have loaned money? And then if you loan money, do you loan it with interest or not? And I guess it depends on the situation. But anyway, so Dad,
I was really impressed with the very first paragraph, actually, that Ellen White wrote here. And it says here, furthermore, because of the selfish course pursued by some who had returned to Judea, in other words, Jews that had gone back to Judea, the Lord's blessing was not resting upon their land, and there was a scarcity of grain. So these are people that you would think were doing the right thing. They had decided to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild it, but it looks like they got sidetracked somewhere along the line. And as you read through the story, it sounds like they became involved with the rulers that were in that area and became very wealthy, or quite wealthy. And then when there was a shortage of grain, they sold or they gave money on loan to them. And that was how the extortion got started. And I was just struggling with 2 things. The number one thing is that it appears from the way Ellen White says this in a couple of different places in this chapter that God could not bless these people because of the way they were conducting themselves. And that made me step back and reflect on myself, saying, are there times when God cannot bless me because of the way I'm dealing with other people? I've even wondered about that within our church. Are some of the hard times that people are dealing with because their relationship with the Lord is just simply not good? And I thought that was an interesting point that I haven't really recalled her saying that sort of thing in that way. Anyway, that was my first impression about it. I thought that these people, they were doing sort of the right thing, but then found a way that they could make some money. And so then, pursued that.
Yeah, so that brings me to what I thought was one of the things that jumped out at me. So I think you've all touched on things that are interesting from this chapter. but what was interesting is that, and I think this is on page, page 647. It's the end of 646 and 647. They talk about Moses and how God actually had a system for dealing with the poor. And I think a little bit of a background is important because it's completely different from what we do in some ways, in that tithes and offerings, specifically tithes, back in the day of Moses, the priests and Levites were used to support the priests and Levites so that they could do their work full time. But then a lot of the offerings, and she mentioned that last sentence, that every third year a tithe was raised for the benefit of the poor. And I don't remember it specifically every third year, but then and she does mention on the next page how they let the land run fallow, basically unused, every seventh year to recover. And if I remember right, that was was that the year of Jubilee, or was the year of Jubilee every 7 sevens or every 49 years where they do the whole year and then they reset everything? I mean, what I'm getting at is that the system within, the tabernacle service was set up to support the ministers and then the people being ministered to, the poor. And that seemed to get done quite a bit. What I don't know, and I have no evidence in the Bible, and if you guys can think of anything, then let me know, was whether this every seventh year actually happened. And it might not have been such a big deal that it actually got recorded. But then more importantly, every 7 times 7 years, every 50 years, basically, there was a year where things reset, i.e. if you sold your property, you sold your kids, and all for money, that you could get those back. And I think there might have been a little bit of a compensation model for it, but everything got you back to the property, to the ability to live the way God wanted you to live. And in a lot of ways, that kept the rich from getting richer and the poor from getting poorer, and reset that society so that, it's like these people were saying to Nehemiah. They said, somewhere in here is that our sons and daughters are numerous, but they aren't any different as far as any better or worse than the rich people's sons and daughters. And that's, so true. And I have no evidence that year of Jubilee, where everything actually got reset, ever really even happened. But that's what jumped out at me.
John, it seems like I thought of that too. And you would think that that's major, right? Why we don't see more evidence of that in, stories or whole chapters of the Bible of like, hey, this is what happened. Because I think it goes both ways. Even like it could be abused from the other side. Like I bet you the 48th year, there was a lot of transactions happening because they knew, guess what? Next year, I'm going to buy everything I can because everything's going to, so you can abuse something that is beautiful for your own benefit. And so I was thinking of it in that, I guess it sounds very negative of me, but I'm like, yeah, that was to stop the abuses from top down. But I wonder how much that got abused from bottom up and saying, look, I know I'm going to get forgiven. I'm going to just loan myself out to the hilt because next year it's all coming back. And that's, I think human nature, we tend to look out for number one. And I think that's part of what we're learning as Christians not to do. And I think it's hard.
So yeah, Lee, go ahead, Dad. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say that it's interesting. One of the things that, right now in this quarter, we're talking about in the Sabbath schools in general, we're talking about tithes and offerings in essence. And it's interesting that they really don't bring this up much. A couple things. One of them is that we are, for the poor, what we're supposed to do, that they gave a tithe specifically for the poor. that means that would not go to the ministry or even to the church. It would go to the poor.
Right.
And I'm not aware, is there, Lee, you're involved with the finances more in the church. Is there some kind of a system that we do tithing that way now?
I'm not, but you bring that up to the conference and see how far that goes with you.
You think that'll be a
I think
fertile
that'll be
area to pursue? Or?
voted down quite quickly. But
Well, Sam may want to speak to that. I don't know.
yeah,
He would be the only one. I mean, none of us are actually on the payroll there.
Conference employee.
Yeah. In any event, but there's another thing that is interesting to me that has to do with the poor, and that is it says specifically that you should not, reap the corners of your fields. You should leave fruit on the trees for the poor to come and get. And this was back in the day when they hand reaped. I mean, they had a sickle out there and were cutting so that they could get absolutely every grain. But now with combines and that sort of thing, believe me, there is nothing left in the corners of anything. And yet that's exactly what the scripture says that we're supposed to do, is to leave things for the poor.
Okay, so then my question is, how do we do that? Or better question, do we do that as a church? Not as a church. Let's start with, as a Seventh-day Adventist religion, do we do that? And then specifically, have we seen that done with our churches? And then potentially talk about how that's done individually. Because I always like to take these truths that we get, I'm holding up Ellen White, but the Bible, and how do we make that practical so that we're living those truths instead of just talking about them? So the Seventh-day Adventist Church, do they do that? And if so, how? There's a big one, an obvious one I'll give the church credit for. And that would be ADRA.
that's what I was going to say.
Are there other ways, though?
Well, and to defend the church in a sense, we have in those days, it appears that was the only way that the poor could be taken care of. But right now, when you're out involved with, for instance, giving out food to people, I very frequently have people criticize in the sense of saying, look, they could get welfare, or they could apply for, that there's all kinds of things that are available for them if they would just use their heads and apply. And so that I'm wondering, is that legitimate? Can we say, okay, now we don't have to really be concerned about the poor because the government is taking care of this. I mean, we've got all kinds of programs for the homeless and for the, below a certain financial bracket. One of the questions I have is, should we be limited by what the IRS will allow as a tax deduction, or should we be considering what we're going to give totally unconnected with the IRS? I was talking about that with one of the IRS auditors recently. And, I would say that the IRS kind of determines how we should treat the poor and churches in various places.
And I think you're referring to deductions that are available with a lot of that stuff. Your church, Dad, has a very large food bank that on a weekly basis ministers, I don't remember the numbers you told me last. It was in the 90s or hundreds.
Yeah, the church here is involved with, there's about 81 people involved with it. About half of them are church members. The rest are people in the community. And they're feeding between 2,800 and 3,300 people a month. And they've distributed, I think it was 55,000 pounds of food last month. But it's in that setting people say, well, really, is this appropriate? I mean, there's people are taking advantage of you and all of that. And I'm absolutely confident that there are some people that are there that are not really poor. They're just looking for a good deal. but from the feedback and from the people that we are actually meeting and going to their homes and that sort of thing, there's no question that there are a group of people that simply there's not enough money, period, and they need the help badly.
Right. And I mentioned deductions. Sam mentioned in the chat box that in England, they have a gift aid system for charities. And if you give to them, the nationally registered ones, the government will match that donation. And there's certainly, it's like you said, Dad, there's certainly government organizations that take care of the poor. There's also private organizations that take care of the poor. Our church has an outreach program, but it's a kind of a quarterly thing with different parts to it that we've done in the past and are hoping to continue to do. Some of it has to do with food, some of it has to do with diapers, some of it has to do with getting help to kids going to school and just need supplies, and some of it has to do with the homeless to some degree. And then our church has also done, we have a lot of dentists, and Jeannie is talking about the Amen clinics, where they've provided free dental care. Our church has also taken dental care as well as medical care and VBS, Vacation Bible School, and evangelism to Bolivia recently and in the past. So, I mean, there are ways of reaching out and helping. That is interesting what you say, Dad. A lot of these people don't need it. They're just looking for the free option.
Well, I mean, even when you go into like Goodwill or something, I mean, I don't know. I kind of feel guilty. It's like, wow, I bought this for $8, and I don't know. It just seems when you're in a position where you don't need that, it's great getting a deal, but sometimes it makes me feel a little bit schmarmy.
Well, yeah, don't get started with Goodwill with my wife and daughter. It's great shopping sometimes, and it is, obviously very affordable. So then that brings up, is other stuff just so highly priced because they can get away with it? Or, obviously this is donated items that Goodwill's making money on to help others and the poor. And so you are in some ways contributing to that. But then there's the issue, like I said, sometimes some of the richest people are some of the stingiest people, and they just live miserably. I mean, what are thoughts on that?
I think you don't know their background, and you don't know a lot of things about them. I think it's easy to assume a lot about people and their finances and what, because we think, oh, this person is super rich. So in our former community, people would, Utah has very high rate of bankruptcy because it's all about appearances. You got to look a certain way. You have toys. I mean, that's snowmobiles and ATVs and all these toys. But, could you really afford them? I don't know. I mean, it's easy to be judgy about people and their possessions and how they use their money and how they don't utilize their money. But I think, from the outside, we can look at even people in the Seattle area. People tend to look at like, oh, how does, Bill Gates use his money compared to,
Bezos.
Yeah, compared to Amazon, and we like look at that and tend to make judgments, but I think in reality we don't know. And I'm not sure.
It's all very personal, right? I mean, I look at it even generational, because I had an older person once tell, oh, well, you should be doing it. It was like their life was set, and they were like, their income was very high, and then I look at someone like, our kids, like they're just coming on. Like it's easy for us to say, oh yeah, don't go chasing money. But when you have nothing and you're like starting a career, I'm not saying it's totally generational, but there's a lot of things that play into those decisions. And you're right, you can't just look at somebody, oh, you drive a nice car, you must have plenty of money. Well, yeah, maybe they have a nice car and lots of debt.
Yeah, so it's interesting. You said don't get personal. Jody's saying don't be judgy, and we are constantly telling our kids, at least, that, you know, what you do in life shouldn't revolve around the money you can make, because ultimately, amazingly enough, there's not a lot of satisfaction in that. And that's just one of those ironies, especially in America. And a lot of people that make the money, the goal becomes to make more money, and they lose track of life in general. But I'll get back to what Lee says, you know, personal. So that gets back to what Ellen White was saying in this chapter. She comes down hard on the church. So right here, just a second.
The bottom
Yeah.
of the page somewhere.
It's this page 651, the last full paragraph. Even among those who profess to be walking in the fear of the Lord, there are some who are acting over and again the course pursued by the nobles of Israel in this story, because it is in their power to do so. They exact more than is just, and thus become oppressors. And because of this, are seen in the lives of those who are named in the name of Christ, because of the church retained in their books the name of those who have gained their possessions by injustice. The religion of Christ is held in contempt. Extravagance, overreaching, and extortion are corrupting the faith of many and destroying their spirituality. And then this is the two sentences I'm getting at. The church is in a great degree responsible for the sins of her members, Sam. And she gives countenance to evil, evil, if she fails to lift her voice against it.
Can I weigh in?
Yeah.
Are you weighing in personally or as the church?
No, I'm speaking personally. I am not the church, and I cannot speak for the church. So I can speak for Eastside. I'd be happy to do that. But so this is such an interesting conversation. I think her words are very harsh because she is really homing in on the notion of greed that exists on a systemic level that has been normalized. And that's the truth. Capitalism has been normalized. It's been normalized not just outside of the church, it's been normalized inside the church. It's the first time I've personally, because I've only lived in England, but only come to a country where it's almost incentivized for you to give to charity because you can put it on your tax return. I don't live in that world. And it's not to say that, oh, America's all corrupt, because we have our own corrupt things in England too. But something came to mind. When the children of Israel left Egypt, they left as slaves with nothing. They were so low on the economic scale that they left as underprivileged. And what God essentially provides for them is an upgrade of social class, where he essentially promises them land, money and provision and a bunch of other things because they had nothing. And I think God is essentially teaching us something. This isn't just about giving to the poor. This isn't just about even setting aside a cash sum amount, but this is about investing in people to the point that we can raise their equity. And I think that it's sometimes it's very easy. Here, take my money, and you walk away without feeling that I've contributed, I've done well, and this is not to knock down anyone who gives to charity or gives their money, but I think that the call of the church, what Ellen White is really bringing out in this chapter, is so much more than just a monetary value, but it's an investment in the people of God, and it's an investment in trying to raise people's social and economic privilege so that they can get to enjoy the same blessings that we do on a general basis. Like, you know, I compare the US and the UK healthcare system all the time in conversations, where I say, yeah, UK has a so-called free healthcare system where you can go in and get checked out and it's fine. But the reality is the quality of that healthcare is much lower in comparison to when you're here in America. I hate the fact that I have to pay money, but the quality of my healthcare is quality. And I think that one of the things, you know, I've been thinking about in my head of what would it look like if we could offer that kind of quality of healthcare to everyone so that it's accessible. And I know this is a conversation that goes on in America here and there, but I think that's an illustrative example of the reality of there are certain people. Let's just talk about the church. There are certain people in the church, and by and large, the Seventh-day Adventist Church is considered to be a middle-class church. We're a very wealthy church on so many different levels. The majority of our membership do well for themselves. And I think if we're inviting people into this community of believers, we're not just inviting them into the freedom of the gospel of Jesus Christ, that he died for your sins and is on the cross, etc. But we're also inviting them into a family that essentially help raise your socioeconomic class in order for you to be able to be a service for those in the church and beyond the church. I'll always shout out to people from Indian families. I can't speak for those here in America, but for those in England, a poor Indian family will immigrate to England. They'll set up, they'll buy one house or rent one house, and the whole family will move into that one house, all 19 members of them. And then they'll put all their eggs into this one individual, a cousin or whatever, to go off and study to become a doctor or whatever it is. And then they try to buy one house. And then they merge the families between the two houses. And then they support one other to go and buy another house and get another career. And they essentially build an empire. And a lot of the Indians in England are very rich because there's this system that they have created. Maybe it's cultural, where they want to raise the socio-economic class of the entire family in order that they can serve each other, to serve each other, to serve each other, to serve, et cetera, et cetera. And I feel like sometimes our churches can be spaces where we come together as compartmentalized families who don't actually pour into each other. And I think what Ellen White is pointing out in this chapter is a responsibility that God places for us to care for each other on a much deeper level than here's $10, but on a much deeper level of here's how we can raise the socio-economic class for the purpose of growing this kingdom and for the purpose of serving those and raising equity all around us. That's all I wanted to add to the conversation.
So yeah, I mean, two thoughts on that. One is that I've done the whole gamut of giving money to organizations, especially if you don't have time and you have money. It is a way of helping others. But at some point I did feel guilty, and it's just like, I'm giving people money, but in a lot of ways my time is more valuable. Am I giving them the best part of me? And so then that kind of is what got me involved with outreach on a local basis, but also in some of this mission work where it is time and money to actually give people your time. And that had value, but then at the same time, it had limits. So both money and time have their limits, and it almost has to be a combination of both. Sam mentioned.
John, can I think it's also heightened in Ellen White's time. I mean, and I could be totally wrong, but I mean, I think the church was the social services. There were some, but very few government services and all that kind of stuff for the poor. Everything was very localized, very community. The church is who supported the poor. I mean, there wasn't Social Security, there wasn't things like that. So you're talking about it was a very heightened also. It was very easy to say, look, if you guys, not just the hypocrisy, but you're the ones who are supposed to be here for the underserved and the poor, and so I think that is also plays into why she was so harsh on the church. I mean, that's just my 2 cents.
No, I totally agree, and that's a great context because things have kind of evolved in the last 100 years, so it's not always that way. Now, I would say there are some churches that are much more involved, and there's a lot of churches, unfortunately, probably more than not, that are not involved, except for on a very superficial level. The other thing, and I'm going to push back against what Sam said, and so I want to make sure I make this point while he was still online, was he mentioned Israel coming from slavery with nothing through the desert to the promised land. and how God was giving him something that was better. And I think Sam was using that word in general. But I'm going to specify, and I want to see what people's reaction is, because in my mind, this system that God set up, whether it revolved around the church that they had with the tabernacle service and how tithes and offerings were supporting the priests and Levites and the poor, but specifically these years of Jubilee, I think in a lot of ways is God's ideal that was initially set up at the beginning, and in a world of sin we got away from, and that God was not just trying to make things better for them. He was trying to give them a blueprint for how you can live a life on this earth with living the kingdom of God kind of a life here on earth. And it wouldn't surprise me if in a new earth that we go to a system that's very similar to that. I mean, it will be a better world. It will be better, easier to grow your own food and live your life. But I think God might be showing us a blueprint of how he meant things to be. We've gotten away from that. He was trying to get them back. We have no record that they actually did it, but maybe that would have made the difference and given an initial heaven on earth, the kingdom of God here on earth, the way it should have been, that maybe we could learn from and even do today. I don't know. Thoughts? And silence. So maybe it's just a deep thought by John.
I don't know, Sam's coming back for it. It's coming back for you.
I pushed back. I'm off the books.
No, I don't think I'm gonna push back against your pushback. Okay, I recognize I'm on a Zoom call with doctors. When a cancer metastasizes, correct me if I'm wrong, there's a point at which that it goes so far, there's only so much you can do, to the point that you can't even be preventative anymore, right?
Right.
You just have to.
You can't cure them. You can only make things better, quality of life, quantity of life, as much as you can.
Right. I agree. I think that God was trying and teach people how to live a kingdom lifestyle. Sometimes I wonder if our capitalist system and other isms that are involved in that has metastasized. And I wonder where it is that we place our responsibility within that. And without trying to be so morbid about the scenario to say, oh, we should just give up and forget this. I think that there is tremendous value in the ability to try and draw boundaries from a worldly system that is so centered on greed. And I only think we can do that. I think the answer is the local church. That's what I think. I think the answer is within a small group of individuals who decide to do things differently. And it doesn't mean, it does mean that we will be conflicted in various different ways. I mean, we're conflicted by simply just having a bank account with said big conglomerates, I don't need to name them or anything. And how far down the rabbit hole do you want to go down, from the person that we bank with to the charities that we align with, who may have certain different values to us, whatever it is. I think that you brought up a very relevant point, and maybe the question that we need to continually be asking ourselves, and this is just not in finances, but in everything, is this choice congruent with the kingdom agenda? And I think you're right. As much as God is trying to teach a kingdom agenda, maybe I'm being a bit pessimistic and saying there's only so much that we can do within this space and within this moment. I want to be hopeful, but the reality is I know that there's always going to be pushback from a very crippled system. And I'm not even blaming our Western world immediately, because we can see from the biblical account, this stuff happened from way back in ancient times. and has just built over time. I mean, there were things that were better back then in terms of the fact that people looked out for each other in a community. There was a sense of social order in the respect of look out for your neighbor, which is now very, very different. But I wonder if we were to create our own community where we all, for instance, under the New Testament principle, poured all our salaries into one bucket and then divided it evenly amongst all of us. I wonder what kind of dynamics that would give to someone who's earning 60K to versus someone who's earning 200. I do wonder how that would work out. I'm not so sure that would be received well. But maybe that is the challenge. Maybe that is the challenge for us to really push ourselves to the point where we usurp the dangerous system that we all give and contribute to on a daily basis. But I do feel, maybe leave it on this hopeful note, but I do feel that God has called us to work within the system that we currently have to give him glory in the best way possible. And I do feel that he's called the church to, at the very least, hold ourselves morally accountable by being reflective on all the choices that we have to uphold the kingdom agenda. I'm not sure if I'm making sense or if I'm brushing a...
No, I think what you're saying is, I mean, do we dump everything as it is, move out into...
No, I don't think so.
Off the grid, everyone pool their money and try to redo what God has, or do we find a way of doing it where we are here and now?
And if I could just quickly add, the Bible does give us some indication of saying, occupy until I come. Mm-hmm. Marry and enjoy life and be a part of this world. And sometimes the narrative that at least historical traditional Adventism can offer, which I think is a bit problematic, is in the world and not of the world kind of concept where we just completely disconnect. But the reality is God has called us to be here in this space to impact people for the kingdom agenda. And so I do feel there is a responsibility for us to step up, be a part of this world, engage in this world, as conflicted and complicated as that can be. And it does require us to have a level of non-judgmentalism of where John puts his money in and how he uses it.
Well, maybe, but probably not. And I'll come back to this. I want to hear what my dad has to say, and then we need to wrap it up. And I think I might have a good way of doing that.
Well, don't get your hopes up. But I would say in talking with John's brother this morning, we were particularly talking about this very chapter, actually. And I think he's online. But in any event, we as a church have spent some time thinking about on an individual basis how this should be. And but there is the question about the systemic system, the way things are run in general. Let me give you an example. We have medications available to us, and for people who have insurance, they can afford it. But some of these medications are $50,000, $75,000, $100,000. Are they available to anybody then? Otherwise, no. Our system is set up so that some people can get really excellent care, but there is a group of people that get really poor care. Do we need to be pushing back against that? Do we need to be looking at the whole system? When you look at Daniel, it appears he became involved at the top of government to improve the lot of people in general. And it sounds like that's exactly the same thing as with Nehemiah here, is that he was at the top of government. He was talking with the king on a regular basis. The king was interested in what he was thinking about. And I'm wondering whether we need to also be involved on a systemic basis of how we can improve access to care, access to money, access to jobs, making sure that everyone is treated equally. I mean, it appears that what you look like it affects how you're handled by the government in some circumstances. And just pushing back in some of these things, maybe that's part of what we should be doing as well. Yeah,
I mean, I couldn't agree more. And Sam was saying, I agree with Sam. You have to live in the world that God put you in, and in the community and the family, the jobs, the schools, the churches is where God calls you to act. And I think he does call us all to act. In this chapter, it's interesting. They mention in Deuteronomy 15, she quotes, "The poor shall never cease out of the land," is how she kind of began the chapter. And then literally the second to last sentence, she hits us with Mark 14. You have the poor with you always. So the poor aren't the problem, I don't think. And we aren't going to have a lot of time to discuss. And so the example I think I got out of this chapter was out of the Bible and is actually out of Nehemiah 5. I agree with what you said, Dad. Nehemiah was well off. He was spending time with the king. He felt it in his heart to help his city, the city of his people, Jerusalem. But then he found people that needed help there. And so he confronted people with this. And the two sentences I want to read come from Nehemiah 5:8. And he says, "As far as possible, we have bought back our Jewish brothers who were sold to the Gentiles." So that implies to me that Nehemiah had money that he used. And I think it was his own personal money. It wasn't the money the king gave him. And from what I can tell in this whole book of Nehemiah, I think Nehemiah had the opportunity to get money from the surrounding nations because the king gave him a piece of paper saying he could do that. I don't think he actually ever did that. So he didn't take advantage of the government he was part of. He used his own money, and he and a group of people with similar beliefs redeemed the Jews that had been sold to the Gentiles somehow in this whole mix. And that's not even what this chapter is about. The next sentence says, "Now you," and he's confronting these people, "are selling your brothers only for them to be sold back to us." So he's getting Jews out of slavery with the Gentiles. He's confronting his own people because they're enslaving his own people. And that's, I think, the extortion, and I think is the rebuke that is there. And it takes, and I agree with Sam that on the church level, I agree with Dad, you and Lee, that it also on the individual level, it takes people to recognize a problem, confront people with the problem, but then to also put that action, those words into action. And so it's interesting that he's already done all of this by the time he confronts them. And they, the next verse is the next sentence. It says they kept quiet because they could find nothing to say. And so he had done the right thing. He confronted the people that were doing the wrong thing. And then he actually ends up using an oath system to get things turned around and move on with building the wall, which is why he was there in the first place. So, I mean, wherever you are, I think there's an opportunity. I think God gives us that opportunity. In this case, it's the poor. And God knows we have the poor, we have the homeless. We have opportunity to take a stand for God. And I think the impetus on us is use our time and our money to start making the difference ourselves, combine our resources with other people with similar interests. But then at that point, we have a leg to stand on to confront the system in America that is so really messed up and not part of the kingdom agenda. But, in fits and spasms, we can move it forward to that kingdom agenda. My wife is pointing out that our time is up. And I appreciate this discussion. I appreciate you being here, Jody. Dad, happy birthday coming up. Not today, but in the next day or two. And then Lee, my brother-in-law. We're all here in Boring, Oregon to celebrate my dad's birthday this weekend. So I'm glad we could have everyone online. Let's bow our heads and then we'll close this up. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for some glimpses into your kingdom and how even on this world of sin, we as sinners saved by you and only you alone can make a difference in other people's lives. Please continue to be with us and lead and guide us. Bless us this Sabbath and help us to have a good day. In your name, amen. Before we leave, this is a weekly Sabbath school program going through the Conflict of the Ages series. After Sabbath school is the sermon, and it looks like Sam is beginning a new series with the story of David. So That will be available to you online as well. If you can come in person, come in person. Fun church, a good group of people. We'll talk to you later.